Good morning. I'm Dilip Gaonkar, Director of CGCC and Director of CTS. The online forum Questioning the Present is jointly sponsored by these two centers. Today's 18th session of Questioning the Present is devoted to Professor Robert Meister's recent book, Justice is an Option, A Democratic Theory of Finance for the 21st Century, published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. We also have a panel of three distinguished scholar respondents, Professor Jonathan Ira Levy, Professor Nina Boy, and Professor Timothy Mitchell. I will introduce all four of our distinguished panelists shortly. Before that, let me state the protocols governing this online Zoom session. Our webmaster, Vidura Bahadur, a graduate student of CGCC. This session is recorded for archival purposes, and it will be released to the public once upon securing the permission of our four assembled scholars here today. The session will unfold as follows. After my quick introduction of all four scholars, Professor Meister will introduce his book, Justice is an Option, for about 20 to 25 minutes, followed by the three respondents, Professor Levy, Boy, and Mitchell, and in that order. Each respondent will have 10 to 12 minutes to deliver their comments, followed by a response by Meister to his respondents for about 10 minutes. By the way, Nina Boy has indicated that she might not use all of her time allotted to her as she is recovering from a recent bout of bronchitis. After Meister's response, we will start question-answer session, starting with a quick comment by three of the respondents. As for question-answer session, please either raise your hands by using the reaction function button on your screen or send a message to Vidura indicating that you wish to ask question by using the chat function. Now to introductions. Our profile speaker, Robert Meister, is a professor of social and political thought in the History of Consciousness program at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he directs also a Bruce Initiative for Rethinking Capitalism. His current research include political and moral philosophy, law and social theory, Marxian theory, institutional analysis, and anti-discrimination law. He is the author of three important books. His first book, Political Identity, Thinking Through Marx, was published in 1991. His second book, After Evil, A Politics of Human Rights, published in 2011, is a critique of the global discourse of humanitarianism that followed the fall of communism in 1989. In this book, Meister inaugurates a new and provocative way of thinking about the moral relations between the beneficiaries of social and political injustice and its victims. His most recent book, titled Justice is an Option, the subject of discussion here today, continues that innovative way of thinking about social and political injustice by shifting the optic towards the topic of finance in a world dominated by financialization. Our first discussant is Jonathan Ira Levy. He is the James Westfall Thompson Professor of U.S. History at the University of Chicago, where he also holds an appointment in the interdisciplinary doctoral program called Committee on Social Thought and serves as the faculty director of the Law, Letter, and Society program. He has several research interests that include economic history, capitalism, global and comparative history, legal history, intellectual history, slavery, and emancipation. Levy's first book, Freaks of Fortune, Emerging World of Capitalism and Risk in America, published in 2012, has won numerous prizes, such as the Organization of American Historians Frederick Jackson Turner Award, and in addition to that, Ellis Howley Prize, Avery Craven Award, and William Nelson Cromwell Book Prize. His most recent published book, in 2021, Ages of American Capitalism, A History of the United States, is a history of American economic life from British colonial settlement through the Great Recession. Levy's next book, Real Economy, History and Theory, to be published in 2025 by Princeton University Press, argues for a novel theory of economy, its history, and its politics. It is drawn inspiration from economics, theories of Thorstein Veblen and John Maynard Keynes, and seeks to offer a theory of economy that is open to rich empirical and theoretical study from across the social sciences and the humanities. Our second respondent is Nina Boy. He is a researcher and an honorary research fellow at the University of Warwick. She studies security issues from transdisciplinary perspective. Her work focuses on the political, financial, and legal aspects of security and is informed by history, archaeology, and also literary studies. Boy's research interests include theories of money, debt, value and collateral, and value of security in political finance, and politics of cashless society. She has worked at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo for the last 8 years, leading a project on financial security. During those years and after, she was active in organizing a series of interdisciplinary PhD doctoral courses and working groups at the Research School of Peace and Conflict. Currently, Boy serves as a co-editor of the post-disciplinary open access journal called Finance and Society. Our third respondent is Professor Timothy Mitchell. He is the William B. Ransford Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He joined Columbia University in 2008 after teaching for 25 years at New York University, where he served as the director of the Center for Near Eastern Studies. Mitchell is a political theorist and historian. His research area include place of colonialism in the making of modernity, the material and technical politics of the Middle East, and the role of economics and other forms of expert knowledge in the government of collective life. Mitchell is the author of numerous books, of which I will mention only two. First, Colonizing Egypt, published in 1991, is a study of the emergence of modern modes of government in the colonial period and an exploration of the forms of reason, power, and knowledge that define experience of modernity. This book has been translated in several languages, including Arabic, German, Polish, Turkish, and Japanese. Mitchell works at the intersection of three distinct disciplinary formations: political economy, post-colonial theory, and science and technology studies. The productive play of these three disciplinary interests is evident in his highly acclaimed book, Carbon Democracy, published in 2012, which examines the construction of modern energy networks and how that enterprise has both expanded and constricted the possibilities of democratic politics. Further, the book explores how the interplay between expert knowledge of the economy and climate on the one hand, and the awareness of Middle East as a security problem on the other, have been shaped and delimited by the imperative to produce and sustain the carbon-intensive modes of life in the Western world. That ends my introduction of our four distinguished panelists today. Now I invite Professor Meister to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip, and thank you all for coming, and especially those of you who are commenting. I really look forward to discussing this with you and hearing what you have to say. Now, the core of my book is a political argument that I can state straightforwardly. It is that financialization explains the ever-widening gap between the rising valuation of financial markets, asset markets, and the rate of increase in incomes and outputs that we call GDP. Asset markets and GDP can now, because of financialization, legitimately grow at different rates, and they can legitimately grow at different rates because they are said to grow now in different senses of that word, growth. Rising asset valuation through capital appreciation, for example, is no longer considered to be the same as or a form of inflation. Rather, it can now be justified to the extent that it cheaply restores economic stability without causing or without increasing inflation. What I am trying to say in this book is that the decoupling of asset market growth from GDP growth explains financialization itself as a political strategy, a strategy for de-risking the accelerated, more highly leveraged growth of capital markets, because this is an anti-inflationary alternative to stimulating growth in outputs and incomes that occurs by activating and then deactivating inflationary and deflationary mechanisms. In other words, this is a political strategy, and it is a political strategy, I argue in the book, that has the added advantage of creating within capitalism an autoimmune response, a response that has been so far successful to the increased volatility, the increased anxiety that is caused by capitalism's own increasing injustice as the rate of capital accumulation through asset market growth appreciation outstrips the growth of real output and real income. In other words, there is an anti-immune or an autoimmune response in capitalism now that converts the directional demand to reverse the increasing inequality that is compounded by capital accumulation by recognizing that if those directional demands are effective, they are effective by increasing the volatility and thus reducing the liquidity of capital markets. And that capital markets now, as a result of options theory, because an increasing component of their valuation consists of financial options and derivatives, now has new asset classes that allow it to benefit and to benefit in a leveraged way from the exponential rise in volatility that movements for directional change produce. So much of my book, the actual content of it, is about this. It demonstrates partly that the options pricing theory itself explains why it was that capital markets were essentially price protected or guaranteed from falling at their present inflated, however bubbly value, because it didn't matter anymore whether you required them to take a haircut. And much of my book demonstrates that this occurs not merely as a result of the conceptual revolution brought about by reimagining capital asset pricing as a version or a variation of options pricing, but it also explains not only why what was done, but that there could have been and should have been contestation about the price of it, about who pays that price, about who gets paid, and about what form of democratic politics could be now reimagined around raising that price and contesting who pays it and who gets paid. So that I regard my book as being a continuation of the condition of Marx, which is about how you can combine justice with abundance by harvesting the cumulative benefits of past injustice, so that, as I say, all that bad history will not turn out to have been a waste. Now, the argument of the book turns on what was revealed about the role of options pricing in the entire revolution that financialization was within industrialized capitalism. And it's worth stating, I think, in a nutshell, what I think happened in 2008. In a nutshell, government restored liquidity to capital markets. It did a technical thing by means of price protecting, guaranteeing, backstopping the market valuations of all financial assets that were used as collateral in credit markets. Credit markets were around $76 trillion at that time. So essentially, you are backstopping the collateral of credit markets. And once restoring liquidity by price protecting assets used to collateralize credit markets are mutually necessary, once they are shown to be the same policy, what I am really working on in describing this as a politics is to show what it means for these to be all but indistinguishable and nevertheless to create a politics around distinguishing them. The politics around distinguishing them is based on the fact that the Fed wasn't legally required to promote liquidity, support liquidity by price protecting asset values, and because price protection is only one of many possible definitions of liquidity and not the main one. No, the idea was that de-risking capital markets in order to restart and then accelerate their growth was something that would have been politically unavowable, if not unthinkable, as government policy even 10 or 20 years before. It was an outright admission, if it had been avowed, that the state would have been captured by the financial sector that it still purports to regulate. So what happened as a politics in 2008 was something that could be explained not as a capture, where capture is the mechanism. It could be explained as a mechanism of what part of what you believe you are doing you are able to disavow as a belief that you believe is held by others. In other words, what part of your belief about what you're doing becomes active and what part becomes passive. The government can say that it disavows one policy and not the other because it delegates to the other the belief that it disavows. Thus, the Fed could actively disavow or actively avow that its technical policy was liquidity support because it passively believed that capital markets believed that they were getting downside price protection. And capital markets could now actively avow that they now have price protection for the first time, but that they got it only because the Fed believed, the regulators believed, that capital markets would destroy themselves, that they would destroy their own liquidity, that they would bring about an event of disaccumulation unless they were protected by price protection. What was new in 2008, on which my book turns, is that capitalism now survives only by exercising its power to put its own future existence into increasing question, to pre-visualize and, in a sense, demand that the government preempt its own demise becomes the way in which it gets the state to guarantee, to lock in the valuations of what has been accumulated thus far so that it can be leveraged at increased rates in order to accelerate future accumulation going forward. Now, this to me, when I wrote my book, was an exciting revelation that capitalism actually can now increase the rate of accumulation, but only by constantly threatening to destabilize itself in a way that makes its possible demise more, not less, imaginable, and thus creates added value for itself from whatever allows a fragile system to continue. In other words, that capitalism accelerates its growth by denaturalizing itself, or as I say in my non-finance courses, immanentizing its eschaton. Fed scholars, especially those who've been writing since my book, implicitly, not explicitly certainly, agree with my analysis. They demonstrate that the money market, the shadow banking system, is at the core of the financial crisis, and that because the money market shadow banking system is essentially an idea that money is issuance is indistinguishable from fully collateralized lending, we have a currency that is now defaultable, and a defaultable currency can only be protected from inflationary and deflationary pressures by guaranteeing, by price protecting collateral markets. And if that leads to accelerated asset appreciation, so be it. The role of the Fed is to preserve its independence by stressing that, yes, you financial markets have this power, but don't overdo it or you'll delegitimate everything. But the bipartisan sweet spot here is that you can have financial capital accumulation through asset appreciation, provided that the public thinks this is the least inflationary way of supporting economic stability as a whole without going through the inflationary, deflationary mechanisms of stimulus. So, in other words, what happens is that accelerating the growth in capital markets becomes democracy's sweet spot, the preferred modality of accumulation, provided that, unlike stimulus, it doesn't operate by creating and then taming consumer price inflation. Now, there's a hair's breadth of difference between what I'm saying and what Fed mavens are saying in terms of what actually happened. The main difference is that they're apologizing for what happened and I'm not. But what I'm saying is also distinguishable from people who are criticizing capitalism and who are criticizing capitalism precisely because they think that capital appreciation without growth, without output and income growth, is not appropriate. In other words, that financialization that has allowed this to happen without stimulating production is prima facie the problem. In other words, by saying that accumulation is no longer through production, you've said it all. Why? Well, they hold a combination of the following views. They think maximizing production is what would justify capital accumulation. They think that increased production that raises living standards, particularly at the bottom, would make capital accumulation more just. They think that accumulating through assetizing economic rents is not ultimately sustainable because rents are not profits and they're feudal and profits are capitalist, and therefore a rentier economy is not justified under capitalism. And above all, they think it is inappropriate to do this because accumulation through asset appreciation and also through creating new asset classes is not really accumulation at all, that it's not real in the sense that inflation is only nominal and not real, because when anything costs more in dollars, a dollar buys less of it. fractions are invertible, and prices are a fraction. Now, there's more than a hair's breadth of difference, probably, between what I'm saying and what my fellow critics of capitalism on the left are saying, because while each of these points that I just sketched out is arguable, debatable, possibly true, all of them amount to saying that the criticism of capitalism is a critique of the intellectual hypocrisy of those who defend and apologize for it. In other words, that it comes down to saying, for example, that capitalists are hypocritical in refusing to invert the fraction of price to quantity when you're talking about asset appreciation in the way that they're happy to do when talking about inflation. Why are they hypocritical? Well, the implicit argument of people who share my critique of capitalism is that the economics profession has simply been hijacked by a cabal of neoliberals who replaced the truth of earlier Keynesian economics that prioritized production with an economics that is indifferent between accumulation through appreciation and accumulation through production. What I argue, in effect, in justice as is an option is first that decoupling asset market appreciation from consumer price inflation is not new in capitalism. It's always been a definitive version of capital, a definitive feature of capitalism, not a bug in capitalism, that you can conceivably index output prices and income levels, but that this is only because you can't thereby index income levels to asset accumulation. In other words, if you could index income levels to asset accumulation, you wouldn't have wage, labor, and capital. You wouldn't have capitalism at all, which means that the driver of capitalism has always been capital accumulation, and it's only its apologists who more or less hypocritically insist that the real justification of capitalism is that accumulation maximizes production. Second point where I differ with others on the left who may view my deep dive into the financialization literature as something that is simply politically bizarre is that the problem with accumulation is not merely that it fails to fund enough production. The problem with accumulation is a problem about historical justice itself. The problem with accumulation is that accumulation compounds the injustice of pre-existing inequality. In other words, compounding past injustice is the new or additional injustice that is specific to, unique to capitalism. And it is an injustice that is something above and beyond whatever we now consider wrongful about primitive violence or originary dispossession that occurred even in the pre-capitalist past, the ongoing effects of which could be described as trauma, which is a repetitive phenomenon, whereas the compounding effect of capital accumulation is an accretive phenomenon. So I have chapters on this, chapters about how understanding capitalism as an injustice compounding machine allows us to see democratic debates about production as themselves the reflection of an historically conjunctural class compromise that allowed capital accumulation to continue. And that this also allows us to see what the high wage, high profit, asset appreciation suppressed economy that many on the left now celebrate really was, it wasn't simply a golden age of justifiable capital accumulation. It now must be understood as a class compromise that is John Levy brilliantly describes in his History of Capitalism, incentivized investment in depreciating assets, machinery, by transforming the valuation and the liquidity of raw materials into commodities that could be sold on the market. But that required a general upward drift of prices, inflation, that could, if it were allowed to turn into wage price spiral, delegitimate government without delegitimating the political power of finance to continue to accumulate. My point is that this is the political power of finance. It's why it is that we have developed policies that monetize asset appreciation without turning the money that is created by increased government debt into government expenditure. And that the reason that inflation is what delegitimizes democracy without delegitimizing capitalism is that it appears to be, in a sense, a short position on its unit of account. You could describe issuing government debt as simply the government shorting its own standard of value, which is presumably or potentially, in the views of MMT people and others on the left, simply a conceptual error, a false theory. They've got the theory wrong. They don't understand what money is. If they understood what money is, then whatever the Fed does in terms of functional finance wouldn't be seen as inflationary, or it would be tolerated as not an inflationary spiral, in which case it wouldn't be an inflationary spiral, in which case we would have less inflation. So it's all just a mistake. My point is that this is not a conceptual error. It was a political achievement that requires a political analysis and calls for a political response. It was made possible by democratic mobilization against any government whose policies could be blamed by inflation, because inflation creates a democratic backlash against democratization itself, which leads the state into a legitimation crisis that then gets resolved by curbing inflation, which is what we're talking about today in the election. The macroeconomic question, the question of my political lifetime over the past 50 years, has how capitalism can leverage a political consensus that inflation delegitimizes democracy into a political consensus that asset value appreciation is not inflation, but is in fact a way to support the economy without inflation. And this is the political question to which financialization was the answer. Now, the rest of my book is really about what then would be a political answer to financialization. I argue something that I now see as simply, options pricing, certainly by raising the floor on collateral market valuations to their present market value, certainly de-risked those valuations, allowed support for those valuations to accelerate asset appreciation. I now see that government has also, in doing that, created an opportunity for added asset market appreciation simply by saying that capitalism's autoimmune response to its own injustice is to take short positions, to sell options about the exaggerated expectations for change that that injustice creates, since it creates those expectations only by means of increasing volatility. Financialization allows you to assertize increased volatility. It's also the case that more and more of the cost of actual living consists of selling consumers what are in effect financial assets, not merely insurance policies, not merely debt, but also user fees, license fees, and so on and so forth, that allow them to continue to get use value out of the commodities that they may have bought per cheap, because those commodities will be bricked, will become useless if you don't continue to buy licenses that keep them current and so forth. In other words, we are living in an economy in which things become worse because people are charged more, and because the politics of this turns out to be a politics about curbing inflation rather than harvesting the benefit of asset appreciation. And people are being sold more and more of what used to be goods and services, but are really nothing other than options, the price of which is dependent as an exponential rate of growth on volatility rather than on incomes.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that this analysis, this political analysis of capitalism, opens new opportunities for anti-capitalist politics, a politics of resistance that leverages and reverses the ways in which capital markets try to grow by threatening their own liquidity whenever they feel threatened by directional change. That this is going to be the story when we talk about whether shadow banking can finance green investments, for example, is whether those investments will be de-risked, and whether this will be the first of many times the global North has repressed the global South in the name of saving the planet and and humanity as a whole. But what we are talking about generally is the ways in which we can reverse how capitalism benefits even more by shorting the volatility that we create, by doing the things that Marx thought capitalism did in the period that Tim Mitchell describes, for example, the period of carbon democracy in which capital industrialism and industrialization empowered the working class. What classes, what movements, what issues, what demands can be empowered and defended and advanced by harnessing the very autoimmune response that capitalism has to us, namely its ability to short the volatility that we create in order to benefit from, to receive the value of the liquidity premium that capitalism has now been able to harvest over the past 20 or 30 years. How can we appropriate, increase, and claim the liquidity premium that capitalism can only harvest because it is not seen to set a price on what it would take to allow accumulation to continue, while allowing its benefits to fund the reversal of the inequality that capital accumulation compounds, so that, as I say in the book, all that bad history will not have been a waste.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. I think we're going to move on to our first respondent, that is Jonathan Ira Levy. Here, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Excuse me, good morning. I think good afternoon to some. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to to talk about Bob Meister's book. It's always a pleasure to engage with, with Bob. I want to talk in my remarks about capital theory, and also the politics of capital in which justice comes to figure. But first, I just want to say a few words about the book itself. What kind of book is this? And it's clearly a Santa Cruz history of consciousness book. That's a compliment. But even in that category, I wonder if I could think of a book just in terms of genre that sort of confounds so many disciplinary boundaries. I mean, there's a good dose of political theory and philosophy in the book. It's obviously concerned with finance theory as such, but also sociological and anthropological interpretations of modern finance theories since Black-Scholes, and engaged with Marx, a lot of Marx, but there's also some Keynes, social theory, critical theory. There's a real historical sensibility. There's economic history in the book. There's also, it's muted, but it's there, a kind of psychoanalytic undercurrent to the analysis. It's a scholarly book that's published by an academic press with, at times, a lot of dense argumentation and prose. But it's also a book that's very much preoccupied with left politics and political strategy. And so all this means that, if you're not walking around with Bob's archive in your own head, and who else really is, that it's a book that can be at times confounding. At times you feel like you're losing the plot, but it's also a book that can be, for the same reasons, and often is, just an exhilarating read, and it's just a very smart book. So I guess that's 3 cheers for a-disciplinary scholarship, not interdisciplinary, but a-disciplinary scholarship, which I suppose is another way to say 3 cheers for philosophy. Okay, so that's one thing about the book. A second thing about the book, it's also, as we've heard, it's a book about 2008. It's about the financial crisis of 2008, or at least was written within its aftermath. Let me, since my discipline is historian, let me just kind of spell out 2 larger historical contexts for kind of placing the book, having to do with 2008. So at first, 2008, it looked like was going to be a major rupture in the history of capitalism. A huge crisis in finance, truly a kind of doomsday crisis, in which many thought, or at least I thought, being young and naive, must lead to a legitimation crisis concerning capitalism. And that didn't happen. The U.S. Treasury Department, the Federal Reserve, it essentially put the global financial system back together again. And so, structurally speaking, with respect to capitalism, 2008 turned out to be a moment of continuity. So I think on the left, despite Occupy, despite Sanders' political presidential campaign, despite a new post-2008 discourse about economic inequality, a certain political helplessness on the left with respect to capitalism actually is what came out of 2008. And as for political helplessness post-2008, I mean, it turns out, I think we now know, that it wasn't capitalism, but rather democracy that began to look shaky. So no economic rupture in 2008, but instead the so-called democratic erosion, democratic backsliding, Trump. Okay, so what to do in that environment? And Bob had, I think, 2 instincts in writing the book, which I think are exactly right, or at least I share them. First, capitalism, with respect to theorizing capitalism, we have to kind of start all over again, sort of unlearn everything we think we know and really start from scratch, because something's gone wrong if you have a theory that categorizes the vast majority of economic activity today as fictitious or not real simply because it's financial. That goes for a lot of Marxism that sees finance as fundamentally fictitious, but also for neoclassical economics that sees finance as not part of the so-called real economy. So you have to sort of start over again, which is a daunting task, to say the least. Second, at the same time, we have to start taking the economy that we have, in which we actually live, as a premise, right? We sort of have to get your hands dirty maybe you don't have to master the Black-Scholes option pricing. That's incredibly daunting. But at minimum, you have to read the Financial Times, right? You have to sort of figure out what's going on in the system as it exists. And Bob, is committed to both tasks. The book's very much premised on modern finance theory, on options theory, which is at the very heart, as he writes about, of contemporary capitalism. But he's also, especially in the earlier chapters, goes back to the kind of ground floor of theorizing capitalism. Now, here it strikes me post-2008 on the left. I don't really know why this is. Maybe we could reflect on it. Maybe it's not worth doing so. But on the left, much energy has been spent in theorizing capital. And I suppose here the phenomenon of Piketty, probably can't be emphasized enough. And I read the early chapters of Justice as an Option as a contribution to capital theory. So what's the contribution? Let me try to just spell out 3 contributions and maybe pose a question or two along the way. So first, Meister interprets financialization as resulting from the realization problem discussed by Marx across all 3 volumes of Capital. So in trying to realize surplus value from production, there's a time gap for the individual producer. Doesn't matter for the system as a whole, where an average rate of profit obtains. But for the individual, a time gap when they don't know if they will individually profit or loss from their investment. So implicit in that moment, Bob says, is an option or potential to hedge one's individual profit or loss against the average rate of profit for the economic system as a whole. If a forward contract allows you to hedge, and now we have those forward contracts to do so. So I think Meister sort of ingeniously, finds a resemblance between that implicit idea in Marx with finance theory, which prices an option by measuring its volatility with respect to an index or an average price for a financial market as a whole. So kind of option implicit in the realization problem in production, and then the option implicit in modern finance theory that you can always price a variation of an asset against the financial market as a whole. And here, I think the big question, at least to me, is, are we dealing with a kind of metaphor here, or are we dealing with a kind of structural phenomenon within capitalism? I guess that's a question for Bob. The sort of second contribution, and related to that, I mean, the real power of this, I think, is that Meister does not oppose industrialization to financialization. So this is not a narrative in which industrialization, industrial capitalism, because of its crisis tendencies or some other kind of contingent mutation, gives way to financialization after, call it 1980. And therefore now we're living in a post-industrial financialized economy. No, so I mean, I think this is a really important contribution of the book, is that Meister has found a way for financialization to be logically implicit within industrial capitalism. So it's not, right? It's not that all the real surplus value in the world is being produced in, say, factories in China, and then Wall Street is doing all this fictitious, not real stuff over here, right? But rather, we should think of China, in this example, kind of facing a realization problem, and therefore all these hedges are occurring within Wall Street. The two things are kind of functionally related, right? Or to make it even more, perhaps, relatable, right? You have Wall Street, through all this kind of financial engineering, providing US households private equity loans on their homes so they have the income to purchase, right, the manufacturing goods that were coming out of China in the 2000s leading up to the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, I think that's basically Bob's sort of picture of how the global economy has been functioning. Okay, the third contribution has to do with liquidity, and that gets to kind of wrestling with capitalism as we know it today. In global finance, in the economy, the central operating principle is liquidity. It was Keynes that first kind of turned liquidity into a category of analysis. And so Bob, there's really an engagement with Marx, but also an equal almost engagement with Keynes in the book. So Keynes says liquidity refers to the ability of an asset to store value. So feudalism, the most liquid assets, the land. What's distinctive about capitalism to Keynes is that money now becomes the most liquid asset. But of course, money is also a means of exchange. So what makes an asset liquid under capitalism, capable of storing value, is now the fact that you can exchange it, you can sell it. In fact, you must be able to sell it for it to continue to store value. It's a distinctive feature of capitalism. So all assets have degrees of liquidity under capitalism. All assets are to some degree money-like, readily exchangeable or not. So at the highest level of abstraction, theoretically speaking, Bob pictures the economy not as a market, not as a vast collection of commodities, not as a realm of material subsistence, but rather as a portfolio of assets stretched out across a spectrum of liquidity and illiquidity. And the move in the book is to creatively link Keynes's notion of liquidity with Marx's account of capital accumulation to arrive at a new theory of justice with implications for democratic politics. Okay, so liquidity is implicit in Marx's realization problem of surplus value and therefore further capital accumulation. Liquidity, according to Keynes, is the store of value function of assets under capitalism. So together, Meister notes that Marxian capital accumulation is contingent upon liquidity, and that if you can't store value, you can't accumulate capital. If you can't accumulate capital, capitalism collapses. If liquidity is maintained, past accumulation persists, which means, according to Bob, that past injustices will persist too. So the liquidity guarantee, which we've heard about in Bob's remarks, actually guarantees the persistence of historical injustice over time. At least that's the argument as I read it. And if we can politicize liquidity such that we can stop rolling over historical injustice into the future, that's an option, right? I mean, at minimum, we should get something for that liquidity premium, for that rolling over of capital accumulation and historical injustice. And so there, I think, in terms of the politics, we heard it from Bob already, there's a sort of politics of hope there, which I think, very much is very much a kind of antidote to the kind of politics of hopelessness that came out of the way the 2008 financial crisis ultimately played out. All right, just one more point and then I'll conclude. Yeah. Okay, so I said 2008 was a continuity, but maybe there were some ruptures, and it took some time for it to be revealed exactly what happened through journalism, really. But by 2011, 2012, by then it was clear, just how massive the liquidity guarantees, the guarantee that there would always be a ready market to price and sell all assets in the financial system, just how massive the liquidity guarantees that the U.S. government provided for the world economy in 2008 truly were. And Bob has a chapter on that. And of course, the postscript is that those guarantees were almost nothing compared to the kind of guarantees that would be offered in 2020 during the COVID crisis. So that's kind of one thing that happened, is just an appreciation of just how much the government was supporting liquidity in financial markets. At the same time, and this is in the book too, 2008 was also the year of the Bitcoin manifesto and the beginning of crypto. So 2008 is kind of this weird moment where, on the one hand, the state, through liquidity backstops, never looks more essential to keeping capitalism alive. But at the same time, 2008 crypto, the birth of a new phenomenon, that seeks to privatize money and use technologies like blockchain, kind of end around state. So two things happening at the same time, both important, that seem kind of contradictory. And I guess, and then I'll conclude, I wonder about 2008. Bob uses throughout the book the terrorist metaphor, kind of evoking 9/11. And essentially, the banks were all holding us hostage. Give us liquidity, and we'll blow up the whole system. And I think that metaphor is actually more telling than Bob lets on. I've come to think that 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis are kind of the same event. I mean, using the same script. Kind of the fear, the sheer fear and panic in financial markets in 2008, which called for this shock and awe kind of government bailout, appears to me to be very historically unique. I mean, it's hard to explain just why bankers and financiers panicked as much as they did in 2008, to the point that they stopped trading with each other almost together, drying up liquidity. So there was a huge bailout and huge liquidity supports, and that's worth remembering. But I'm just not convinced that the huge kind of implicit government liquidity put has sort of always been there. It is still worth as much as it was worth that moment. I mean, I'm not even sure how you would sort of have this argument, quite frankly. But at least I do wonder to what degree the largest banks, corporations, are kind of busily figuring out, as we speak, ways to use new technologies like blockchain, such that kind of massive selling offs, like what happened in 2008 or even 2020, kind of won't happen again. I mean, the degree to which banks are figuring out how to use technology and corporate power to perhaps dispense with the dependency upon state support and state liquidity guarantees, as was the case in 2008. But I guess the final thought that I think falls from this, and that I will conclude, I like a lot of the kind of ideas in the book about what to do in bailouts or what to do in financial crises. When asset values plummet, Bob says governments should essentially create public investment vehicles that take out options that go long on a market recovery. I mean, that just strikes me as a great idea. Why not do that? But I still also think, to some degree, for democratic politics, to get a grip on capital, that politics has to find a way to make capital less liquid, right? I mean, to some degree, that if you can't fix, hold, territorialize capital in place, you just can't place political demands upon it, including demands for justice, however defined. And so I'll pose that as a question, and then turn things over to our next respondent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now we go on to our second respondent, Nina Boy. Here you are, Nina. Floor is yours.
Hi, and many thanks for the invitation and the kind introduction. And even though you shouldn't, I'm going to start with an apology, because my situation is that I haven't been able to work for the past 2 weeks, and I tried to skim a book today that essentially can't be skimmed. So I won't be able to do justice to this book, and I regret that, because there are so many aspects in it that I've been interested in: collateral, safe assets, liquidity premium, apocalypse, material and immaterial yield of safety, autoimmunity, that this book brings together in an amazing way. So there's definitely loads for me to think about in the future. But first of all, I second this this laudation of the book. I think it's brilliant in the way that at the same time it's political and intellectual in a way that I haven't really seen any other book to be, because they tend to be more political or more intellectual. And so it's just an incredible achievement. Okay, I'm just gonna pick up on some things that I managed to pick up on. Okay, so the first question is on power. And I wonder, who is the sovereign in your analysis? And what kind of definition of sovereignty is that? Is it the Schmittian, the one who decides on the exception? Or is it Mirowski? A sovereign is he who decides what happens to collateral in a state of emergency? Is sovereignty always tied to an obligation, as in the ability and willingness to pay, the definition of sovereign creditworthiness, and also the definition of good faith in international law, which is also a kind of ability and willingness to submit itself to this obligation of pacta sunt servanda. And are you trying to restore sovereignty to government in demanding that a justice or liquidity premium is paid, or are you trying to give it to oppositional social justice movements or democracy? My second question is about the finance security connection, where you say that you present it as a kind of convergence of liquidity and security industry, both of which are tied to the capitalist state. And I of course agree that the political and financial fields are conceptually entwined via notions of security. Safety is at the heart of financial valuation, but I wonder if there is also different valuations of security in finance and politics, a different view of the cost of security, which means that security in politics is valued positively in a way that it isn't normally in finance theory. Just if we think of hoarding or stockpiling, that was clearly something. I mean, that's the whole reward for the liquidity premium, is to not hoard, right? To not stockpile. But now in this apocalyptic imaginary, hoarding is changing from an irrational to a rational behavior. And stockpiling, bunkerization are seen as neoliberal governance in a way that's completely at odds with, finance theory's valuation of safety. I wonder, I mean, Jonathan has mentioned that there's been no new economic paradigm after the crisis in the way that there was after the previous crisis with Keynes's general theory. But maybe there is a new paradigm of security. And what I mean by that is that expresses itself in a changing valuation of security. And that in itself means that finance and security, political security, become entwined in different ways. And part of that expresses itself. I mean, a lot of what I'm saying might not necessarily contradict the book, because I haven't been able to, fully engage with it. So I'm just going to say it as like that. So if we look at the post-crisis sort of developments as a kind of security capitalism, then that would involve very different notions of security. We would have the unsecured obligation, the secured obligation, and existential threat all at the same time, whereas possibly some of these notions were very critical in previous periods of capitalism. For example, when negotiable instruments changed or depersonalized the relation between the capitalist and the investor. Well, okay, I'm not going to be able to go into detail, but just to, or then we have collateral-based finance from the 80s, which foregrounds this kind of notion of security. And then we have existential threats post 2008. So I'm wondering how these different notions of security come together in the analysis. Okay, then the book was published in 2020, but I'm wondering just your thoughts on what's happening now in this development that's being called geoeconomics, where there are new kind of perceived security risks, or actually maybe threats, posed by the interdependence of financial globalization, weaponized interdependence. We have what's been called sovereign privilege, where it's the sovereign and not the market that defines safe debt, whether, you know, whether debt is safe. And I wonder how you see this shift in power in geoeconomics between state and capital. Do you see it, you know, as maybe in the de-risking state, that the state is once again captured and basically forced to subsidize financial profits? Or do you see security as a sort of hostile logic to economic logic and circulation? And you can see this kind of conflict, for example, in the question of the seizure of Russian reserves, you know, this standoff between the ECB and the Commission on the question whether this is something that should happen or not. I mean, there seems to me to be more conflict between those two regimes of power, maybe, than I could see in the analysis at this very quick glance. Then I'm wondering, but yeah, I'm wondering about the liquidity premium. Didn't Tobin play a major role in transforming the liquidity premium into risk aversion, which then formed the basis for the asset pricing models? And I don't know the option pricing formula in as much detail. So, but just in terms of the CAPM, where there is no liquidity premium, how does that relate to your argument where you basically see finance theory as the critique of neoclassical economics? And finally, and my last question is about collateral. What is the significance of collateral being sort of, you're kind of, you're seeing it implicitly in Marx's analysis, but it's not explicitly posted, if I understand it right. And what does that mean? I mean, what is the difference between collateral being implicit or explicit? And the last question is on this metaphor of the financial market being, well, both almost holding government hostage or threatening to blow itself up, which is a kind of, it also relates to collateral in the sense of the historical sense of security, which is which also has this very long period of posting hostages to secure agreements, and these kind of sureties or hostages of peace later around the 20th century, end of the 19th century, turned into hostages of war when they were no longer given but taken. And this kind of informs the meaning of hostage we have today, right? As something taken with violence and not given freely, even if that free giving might also be not entirely voluntary. But just to say that there's also a connection in this, there's yet another connection to security here. Okay, I'll leave it at this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nina. And we go to our final respondent, Professor Timothy Mitchell from Columbia. You have the floor, Tim. We can't hear you.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be here, and thank you for the two previous respondents and their wonderful questions, and thank you above all to Bob for this book. As Jonathan says, what kind of book is this? I've always been struck since I first read it, the way and marveled at the way Bob is able to combine the role of political philosopher and political economist. I don't think there's any other thinker who combines those two modes of thought in this way. And to me, the book is very much a model of what both a critical political economy and a critical theory of justice can be. I've arranged my questions somewhat in historical sequence because while a lot of our discussion so far, not all of it, but much of it is focused around 2008 and the sort of spur to the book in thinking through and with that crisis. It is, as others have said, an entirely new way of thinking capitalism over a much longer period. And I think the point that you reiterated, Bob, in your introduction, that capitalism now survives by making evident its own contingency, by putting its own future existence into doubt, and then through the development of ways to monetize that doubt, that instability, that non-inevitability, is not just a way of understanding events since 2008, but also is a very profound challenge to thinking, to historicist modes of thinking about capitalism. If historicism itself, a certain notion of the historical inevitability of capitalism, or the historically determined form of its unfolding, is not something we should be addressing simply in order to add to it or refine it, but in the light of living in a world in which that very question of historical inevitability is itself been turned into a source of extraordinary profit and inequality. So in that sense, it's a very sort of anti-historicist argument, which is one of the things I like about it. And partly for that reason, I wanted to pick on, actually sort of organize my questions around it, a series of key points, and ask you to maybe spell out a little bit more the ways in which you are contesting a standard and a more historicist account of capitalism. You know, contrary to most accounts of financialization that Jonathan said sort of tie its history to commodity production and a shift from production of commodities to an era of financialization, you insist that commodities have always had to be financed, have always had to be financed endogenously. That is to say, always found a way of assetizing their own product in advance in order to finance the process of production. But I find that framing of it to perhaps still sort of stick with a prioritization of commodity production. It's a certain sort of burden placed on commodity production that it must solve this realization problem. It must somehow find a way around the problem of assetizing its own product in advance. But why can't one pose that the other way around, that, and place it not in a history of commodity production, but perhaps in a history, if you want to keep a sort of historical language, of assetization, and understand commodity production as something of a historical detour, that processes of assetization took at a certain moment in a certain corner of Northwest Europe, somewhere in the late 18th and early 19th century, and sort of asked not how was commodity production financed, but how and why at that point was finance or assetization materialized in a new way through this new mode that came to be known as industrialization, and to understand even the Industrial Revolution itself as something more of a disturbance in the trajectories of assetization, albeit one, of course, that then introduced a whole set of tipping points, not least in the transformations in the production of energy that had unexpected consequences. But does your sort of positioning of the realization problem as a problem of assetization sort of enable us even to rethink that kind of historical moment? I guess is the first question I wanted to ask you about. And ask you about it in relation to what I understand you to be saying, and I'd really like you to clarify that the very value of that historical account of capitalism, of historical injustice, is something that is itself contingent and given a value. So the writing of the history of capitalism, writing the history of capitalism as a process of so-called primitive accumulation, dispossession, and so on, gets valued in different ways depending on this current politics of insisting on the instability or the non-necessary character of capitalism as a course of history. So there's something sort of more profound about the history of capitalism that I think comes out of your very rethinking of capital in relation to history. So that would be a first set of questions around the sort of early and more classical history of capitalism. The second one would be around your sort of equally important and challenging way of rethinking the mid-20th century in Keynes, and this moment of the invention of what we came to call the economy. And specifically, as you put it at one point, where the state positions itself as the body responsible for growth, for the growth of GDP, in such a way that that becomes the collective benefit that is going to compensate for earlier injustices. And that, in your account later on, is going to give way to a different mode of thinking of the way in which the state compensates for early injustice, not through growth, or at least not through the growth of the economy, but through the protection or the growth of asset prices. And I'm interested in the very sort of peculiar historic specificity of that moment, that Keynesian moment, because again, it's not simply in your account a sort of history of different phases of capitalism, the arrival of monopoly capitalism, the arrival of Keynesianism, of state management of the economy, but it is at the same time a shift in what you're calling forms of justice, modes of justification, that I think is a really important way of repositioning how we think of that moment. And you've positioned it, and these discussions you and I have had before, in particular in relation to this extraordinary power for a while that organized labor acquires to sabotage capital accumulation, thanks to the phenomenon of the general strike and other features of leading up to that period that come to be defeated, I've argued, in part by the production of the economy as the object to be managed, in order to interrupt that power of sabotage. And I guess the question I have there is that how significant for you is it that production of the economy, the devising of measures, of ways of measuring well-being through the very detailed technical modes of constructing this object that comes to be called GDP, what is put into it and what is excluded from it, performs this role not just of sort of helping us see an object, the economy, which is not yet that of the world of financialization, but rather does the work of putting what will later be called finance out of sight, precisely by not measuring assetization in the production of national income accounts, or certainly not measuring it as an addition to collective well-being. And you're talking about a shift between that and a later moment. But I'm very interested in how you see the significance, not of the later moment when well-being shifts from the promise of improved growth to the promise of asset price appreciation, not just as sort of reflecting, the different kind of economy we have there, but actually reflecting what the production of the economy as an object of politics was doing collectively. And at the same time, then, sort of echoing the question I asked about the sort of period 150 years or so before the early 19th century, and understanding industrial revolution itself, if you like, as a kind of detour, that we should think of that mid-20th century moment also as an interruption to things, rather than as the norm that financialization or assetization has somehow disrupted. So that's a second area where I just really value seeing how you think about those transformations. Then I have some questions about the more recent period that has been a lot of the focus of the discussion, now that the state, as you put it, is responsible for the growth of the value of assets rather than the growth of the national product, and that you want to see that in a less negative light than critics of financialization would perhaps see it, and see it as opening up a field of political possibility rather than simply as an irretrievably negative shift from real production to as Jonathan put it, the fictitious, the financialized. So what I don't understand in your not necessarily more positive account of assetization, but your insistence that we see its political possibilities, is how that fits with the notion that any process of assetization and any process of focusing on the protection and the increase in asset values, let's say the values of people's houses or of their retirement funds or anything else, must surely always be an imposition of a cost on the future. So because that very process of assetization involves the present discounting of some future value that is going to have to be repaid in the future at full price. And I suppose this conventional account would be, well, that future will be a bigger pie, because not only will assets have grown, but the productive economy will have grown, and so there will be a larger pie to divide up to pay back the claims on future that were constructed through assetization. But if that's not the way you want us to see it, as assetization something that operates merely in the service of a real or more productive economy, then who actually pays the price of assetization? I mean, one of the arguments made about contemporary forms of assetization is that something that previously was the preserve of the rich has become the necessary survival mechanism of the middle class. That people who previously counted on increases in income from their productive life now rely more and more on the rising value of their retirement funds and of their property. And this has actually become a survival mechanism of middle classes in wealthier countries and in fact more broadly. But it's always going to be at the cost of those who come later, whether it's just younger people today who could never imagine affording the houses whose asset value has been protected and increased that their parents were once able to afford. So I don't quite understand how your argument there, I mean, beyond the argument about wanting to open up the politics of assetization and see how it happens, really explains who's paying for that increase in asset values. That's my third set of questions about this shift you identify towards a politics of asset value increase. I have a fourth question, but I don't want to go over time. But it's ones you've touched on in the book and elsewhere, but how all this relates, and it continues directly from my previous question about the future, and particularly the future in relation to climate politics. And I know you have an argument about how Green New Deals can be thought differently along in terms of the way you want us to think about the politics of finance. And but I'm interested in the way this is actually a very sort of anti-growth book, but it doesn't quite frame it in those terms. And I'd be curious to hear you say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. So we have had 3 wonderful respondents with lots of things on your table. You have about 10 minutes, Bob, to respond. I know that is not sufficient time, but we have to save some time for the question and answer.
Yeah, well, these are wonderful comments from people whose work I draw upon and admire greatly, and it would take me far more than 10 minutes to respond to all of them. Let me just say what I can in, I guess, going in reverse order, because that's what's on my screen. And you stop me, Dilip, when you should. Climate change first. Is this an anti-growth book? Yes, this is moving toward an analysis of the ways in which the ecosphere, the cybersphere, and the valuation sphere are in effect one sphere that operate by differentiating themselves from each other. So the question about climate change and green finance is the question that Daniela Gabor and Nina and so forth have also raised in their work. Can we have a green revolution by industrial policy without de-risking the assetized versions of climate investments in a way that essentially involve imposing the salvation of the global North and its way of life on the global South through political repression? And I am very interested, particularly in my current teaching since the book, on that question and on reading the critical macrofinance literature against the literature about how China's approach to green investment is precisely an industrialization, almost a war economy, to do the equivalent of paving the world by covering it with solar panels and creating a market for green products. Industrial policy, assetization, and so on and so forth need to be understood as important components of a world in which data collection is essentially indistinguishable. Ranking, creating spreads, gaps between ranks is indistinguishable from the valuation sphere. So this is all stuff we have to understand that I'm now working on, which gets to Tim's second question about assetization, and particularly about the asset form and its relation to the invention of an economy. What I am arguing throughout the book, and even more in my work since then, is precisely that the asset form and the commodity form cannot be distinguished from each other in the way that Marx's account of capitalism requires, unless you are also saying that assets can be monetized as the price of selling them as collateral against which you can borrow. So you're talking already about a spread between something's valuation as an asset and something's valuation as a commodity, where the reversibility of that spread makes valuable an option in just the way that adding a money-back guarantee to a portfolio of assets makes valuable an option. In other words, the option form has to be understood as what explains the gap or spread between the same thing's price as a commodity that can be sold and its valuation as an asset in which how much you can borrow against it as collateral depends upon the issue of what Nina would call security, which goes back to Tim's earlier question, again, just taking it in reverse order. The invention of the economy as GDP is exactly the kind of financial strategy that I'm saying financialization was, in the sense that it takes assetization out of the picture. And what I'm suggesting is that the economy, which was seen as an object of policy for the state, requires implicitly the construction of the point of view of the financial sector toward whether it can still be an economy in that sense, as kind of the vanishing point in the picture that's no longer part of the picture, the point zero, as it were. So that, I am arguing, is political work. It's not conceptual confusion that is the result of an intellectual coup in economics departments. And that is why talking about whether this burdens the commodity form too much is exactly the right question with which Tim began. Yeah, I mean, I now see production as another form of liquidity transformation through an arbitrage opportunity that is made historically, it is enabled historically by what Tim calls carbon democracy, but that that essentially it's in large part a form of value appreciation through liquidity transformation of raw materials into commodities by means of investing in depreciating assets, incentivizing investments in depreciating assets, because the spread between something's future value as being transformed as opposed to being transported, or as opposed to being simply stockpiled or warehoused or whatever, that making transformation through commoditization is simply one form of asset transformation. That's my general account of capitalism that focuses on its historical specificity, which is something I've learned first from Tim and now from Jonathan as well. So that gets me to Nina and particularly the things I've learned from her about the relationship between security and hostage taking on the one hand, and security and asset valuation on the other, and the ways in which the power to take hostages relates to the valuation of assets. There's so much to say in her work that I would love to discuss with her in the future. I begin my classes with her work very often on these questions. But what I am talking about here is precisely what she is asking me to talk about, which is the relationship between collateral-based finance and existential-based finance. One way of describing what I just said about it in my opening comments is that collateral-based finance becomes existential-based finance in 2008, which is the big reveal. The big reveal that has changed our politics ever since then. And she's asking me to describe how our politics has changed since then. I guess I'd like to turn around and ask her, because she's one of the emerging experts on that. But yes, it's interesting connecting this back to Tim's question, to imagine that stockpiling, speculating, transporting, shipping, and producing are all in this conception of the way in which the invisible costs of assetization are what focuses politics on the GDP. That this has become what is the political work that I think is increasingly unsustainable. That this is what this is what the election is about this week, is that people are being squeezed by the assetization of the economy, by the fact that more and more of what they spend is the result even of the costs of options that they purchase in order to continue using what they've already bought. A license, to prevent the thing from, prevent your phone from becoming junk, you have to continue to subscribe to the upgrades. And so, I mean, everybody is feeling squeezed by things that are not part of the valuation of the GDP, because they're being tied to the appreciation and growth of asset markets, and are being experienced by people as though they were forms of inflation that's delegitimizing government policy. This is just a huge problem that Trump is benefiting from, and that Harris doesn't know how to address. And I'm very worried this week as a result. I want there to be questions. I see there are questions. Yeah, John, politics in a way needs to find a way to make capital less liquid. The question that you and I have been discussing, and I hope we can keep discussing, is whether harvesting or reappropriating the liquidity premium as the price democracy can extract for allowing capital accumulation to continue makes capital less liquid. That is to say, whether the active passive dimension. I mean, that is to say, what part of what I mean, if I think two things are indistinguishable, how does the part of it that I believe distinguish itself from what I believe only because of what I believe others believe? And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the relationship of liquidity to valuation, is the relevance of one's beliefs about the beliefs of others to what one believes oneself believes and is willing to avow as one's own. That's what Keynes and Freud add to Marx, that you and I find so valuable in our work going forward. And if we want to apply our work going forward to politics, that's what we should be talking about. Is this a metaphor? Maybe let me just answer that by saying liquidity is also a metonym. That is to say that the ability to monetize a price is what liquidity is all about. And the metonymization of a price or the liquidity of a price, that is to say, its degree of variability is the metonymization of a metaphor. And I'll stop with that.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. And we have 15 minutes. We have 2 questions from people. I had promised the respondents to give an opportunity for them to respond. First, before we ask the 2 questions, would any of you want to say something before we take the question from the floor? Jonathan, you're going to, okay. Nina, we'll come back to you later if you want to.
Yeah,
ask.
let's take the questions first.
Okay. Tim, similarly, you want to say something? Or yeah. Okay, we'll take a question from Prathama Banerjee. Prathama, are you there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, of course. So what a fantastic panel. And I actually read the book pretty much a couple of months after it came out, and was confounded, to use Jonathan's word, to begin with, and excited soon after. So to keep it brief, 3 thoughts for you, Professor Meister. The first is, how does the story look if retold from perspective of the question of global redistribution as opposed to US history, especially in context of the fact that in a place like India, where I come from, for instance, the commodity production detour happened only marginally, but the assetization story starts from the very beginning. From that very moment of quote-unquote developmental economics to the current moment when globally the BRICS US story is in some senses about the weaponization of the dollar as a reserve currency. And in some senses, Nina was gesturing towards this, the dollar clearance system as a way of thinking geopolitics anew, where the question of reparation and global redistribution is at the heart. But, so how does the story look, the assetization story, and look from a global rather than a kind of national US perspective is one thought that I had, and which is of great concern to us in other parts of the South, as it were. The second thought was, commodity, asset, a kind of missing term, a missing empirical, historical term is real estate. I wanted to ask you how the story of collaterals and assetization has very much the story of what is called real estate at its heart. And the story of when the home becomes a collateral and the generalization of the assetization principle happens via the story of home and real estate. So I just wanted to flag that and ask you if you have particular thoughts on that moment. The story of land is one thing, but the story of real estate is another thing, and it's a global story again. Which brings me to my third thought, which is that when I finished your book, I had the feeling that you are saying that the political lesson, the democratic lesson that we can draw from the story of rethinking capital as a process of, pricing time, as it were, the democratic lesson is the occupy lesson. To render assets illiquid and thereby hold the financial market accountable to general public would require literally, physically occupying areas and terrains that are apparently liquid but can only be rendered illiquid by, in a sense, Jonathan said it, by re-territorializing what appears as virtual and financial. I'm not sure if that's what you're arguing. I just wanted to ask you if Occupy becomes, in some senses, the metaphor for current democratic politics in your imagination. So,
Thank
yeah, so
you, Pratima.
thank you.
Very good set of questions. But because of time, let's take Anna Davis. That's the only question we're going to take. Anna, you're there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, we'll take Anna Davis. And after Anna Davis's question, Bob, you'll respond to those. And we'll also invite three respondents to address those questions if they wish to. And that way we can come to a kind of a conclusion of this amazing session. Anna?
Yes, thank you very much for, again, a wonderful session, great dialogue and contributions. I wonder about the concept of time, and I'm wondering, Postone talks about time as being abstract labor time, but also historic time, that there are two different types of time. And I'm wondering, again, this is a question, is there some form of concrete time? It's no longer abstract labor, it's no longer long-term history, it's the concrete time of human reproduction in ecology, so that what we're calling abstraction, which is based on the commodity labor power, is really abstracting from the real necessities of life, which is work and stable environment. And so Professor Meister has talked about relative surplus value in financial markets, as well as relative surplus value in the labor markets. But is there essentially only human time, and that this abstraction is misleading us from the concrete tasks of human and ecological sustainability? Thank you so much.
Okay. Now we have going to start with Bob. You can respond to the questions, and then we'll call upon Jonathan and Nina and Tim in that order so that they can say something and also the concluding remarks. Okay, Bob?
Okay. How can I answer these questions together to leave time for others? I think one way at it, which deals with the questions about rent and real estate, about real estate and the third world, but also the question about concrete time as human time. I think I can answer this by focusing simply on a question that I didn't address enough in my earlier response, which is rent. A lot of work on these topics, including post-colonial or decolonial studies, in terms of exploitation and so on and so forth, talks about rent and the distinction between rent and profit as essential to capitalism. That is to say that capitalism legitimates profit by delegitimating rent. And that then gives you a decolonial analysis. It gives you an analysis that suggests that what's wrong with finance is that it's a return to feudalism because it's based on rent. Well, my argument in general flips that view, and I think that came out in Nina's question also. about the relationship of sovereignty to valuation. My argument suggests that the logic of rent as a mode of accumulation, or at least the logic of describing bad accumulation as only rent, which is what Tim is pressing me on, really misunderstands rent as a way of assetizing the gaps between spreads. Real estate, which Smith and Ricardo described as essentially feudal. Really too bad that increased production is taking the form of rising land values based on the ability to capitalize on different fertility rates. Marx uses the same analysis within production to explain what he regards as the fundamental dynamic driving capitalism forward, which is to say that because prices are sticky downward, there's an arbitrage opportunity in economizing on labor and converting raw materials into liquid commodities that will not fall in price as fast as their production costs will fall, unless they do, and then you've got a realization problem and no way of hedging it. Well, what we're talking about here are rents, but we're talking about rents differently than we were when we were simply ascribing them to an earlier phase of production. We're talking about an economy and a world that is based on assetizing rents. And then we get to a further question, I think, which came up in the comments and I think lies behind the questions that I just got. There's a different view of what's wrong with capitalism than my view, which focuses on assetization simply as a discounting process in which the future is automatically devalued based on the income rate. Discounting is based on the notion of the drift of capitalism, that is to say, reversion to the mean. It's based on the average rate of return. What I'm suggesting is that the problem with understanding assets is partly a political problem that bears on the third world in the transition from coal to oil, for example, within carbon democracy, which is the degree to which, instead of discounting future value as the question of who pays for the present cost of assetization, what we are talking about now is creating instability, creating volatility, denaturalizing the economy as the very thing that capitalism can now benefit from as adding to asset value over and above the component that's a result of the discount rate. And that is a huge political achievement. And it needs to be opposed politically by capturing the value added that results from the volatility that the injustice of capitalism provokes us to create.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, we are reaching our time. You know, the asset in a session like this is audience. We'll start losing them very quickly after the time is over. So shall I call upon Jonathan to have a concluding remarks? We have audience will stay for a while.
Okay, I'll try to make a brief remark that just sort of is an association with the discussion we had so far. I mean, I think that maybe Keynes's greatest contribution was to to force us to see that under capitalism, it's the future causes the present, or ideas about the future causally causes the present as much as our inheritance of the past. And when you kind of end up in that space, as I have, you start thinking about a politics of expectations and our ethical relationship to the future and the future's ethical relationship to us. And one of the striking things about Bob's book is actually when he talks about liquidity, he emphasizes the persistence of historical injustice in terms of maldistributions in the past, or the kinds of histories involving colonialism, exploitation having to do with global justice types of questions. And so there's a way in which the book kind of crosses our relationship to the future with issues of reparative justice in a way that's extremely challenging. And I think, as Bob says in the book, it's right, can't be captured in terms of distributive justice if we think of distributive justice as an issue of slicing the pie in the present. And so that kind of ethical conundrum of how past, present, future relate, you could scramble those terms, future, present, past relate, I think is a really ethical conundrum. I mean, a conundrum both in terms of ethics, but also for our politics moving forward. And just to say that I think that the book is, if you haven't read the book and you're in the audience, you're in the audience, and you haven't read the book already, another reason to read it is because it's such an invigorating kind of sustained reflection on these issues.
Thank you, Johnson. We are going to go on to Nina. Nina, would you like to say something before we close?
I'll just briefly pick up on this question that Bob posed about how to conceptualize what's going on now in this so-called geoeconomic turn. Because if the liberal problem of security was seen from a maybe Foucauldian angle, was how to secure circulation through risk, through collateral, through war against terrorist finance, which held even up until post 9/11, this is no longer the main problem in the geoeconomic constellation, which has it means a different problem of security, but we haven't really figured that out because it's a really interdisciplinary challenge. And one of the problems it faces is that I would say that IPE and critical security studies have different valuations of security and different critiques of it. So it's not easy to make them compatible. For example, with climate risk, if climate risk was successfully accommodated in monetary policy, it would be seen as a success, but as a politicizing move. Whereas in critical security studies, that kind of securitization would be a depoliticizing move. So yeah, I'll just leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. And then we go to Professor Mitchell.
Thanks. Just very quickly, I guess with Nina's point about security, if I could connect it back to the point about that Bob just reiterated about the ability to turn instability into the very thing that capitalism can profit from. Surely those two ideas can be very closely linked, and I'm sure in your work, Nina, you're doing that. To me, and this is also in relation to Jonathan's point about expectations. The interesting thing about shifting one's understanding of capitalism to these questions of assetization and securitization is that I think it opens up much, much richer understandings of the politics of time and the construction of time, because it opens up obviously questions around the future and of expectations, but also the future as something that can be not only uncertain and one can profit from the uncertainty, but also can be controlled in extraordinary ways. I mean, assetization is always a political and economic claim on the future, and it's the element of control rather than the element of insecurity or uncertainty that is the basis of that, even if then, as Bob insists, having established that control over some asset understood as a claim to a future payment, then with the development of derivatives and other methods, you can then turn the element of insecurity or uncertainty or instability that arises from the prior certainty and stability into a further asset. And that's something I've learned very much from reading Bob's work, and like Jonathan, others, I would commend it to you to make sense of all this.
Thank you, Tim. So we're going to conclude now. Thank you so much for Bob to agreeing to have this session for his book. And then thank you so much for Jonathan, Nina, and Tim for agreeing to serve as respondents and having done such a wonderful job as respondents, which is very enriching for our audience, both who are present in this session and those who will view it on the YouTube or some other vehicle. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Nina. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, Tim.
And thanks,
Bob,
and
you want
thanks
to
to
say
you.
something
Dilip.
to- Bob, would you like to conclude by saying something about?
I'd like to conclude by saying thanks.
Okay.
Thanks to you all.
Thanks.